I'd like to introduce Dr. Thomas Cowan from San Francisco in the United States. Thank you for joining me, Thomas.
Thank you.
Could you tell me when you first heard about LDN?
I first heard about LDN it was about 13 years ago. I had a friend who had a incurable so-called lymphoma. I think it was a B-cell lymphoma. And he called me up and said that his lymphoma was basically all gone. And I did what I considered the sensible thing, which was to ask him what he did, which it's always been, just as an aside, not to get into mudslinging right off the bat, but one of the things that's always struck me about patients is often if they go to a conventional doctor and they say, oh, I did a lot better, and they say, do you want to know what I did? And the doctor says no. I always think, I mean, if I ever hear somebody who, I don't care if they camel dung or whatever, I'm interested to know what they did. But anyway, so Jerry said, well, he took low-dose naltrexone. And, of course, I had been an ER doctor, so I knew something about naltrexone, but I didn't know this use. So anyways, I looked into it. At the same time, I also had an AIDS patient who had asked me to prescribe it. So those two things about 12 years ago. It took me probably another 2 years before I was, I wouldn't say convinced enough, but I would say knowledgeable enough that I could start prescribing it on my own. And so I pretty much have been for about the last 9 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say the conditions that your patients have tried LDN for?
Probably the most of them are ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And that's partly because I've written a number of things about those two illnesses, so I tend to get a lot of patients who are interested in, who come to me with those diagnoses. So I pretty much always prescribe it for that. But I also use it for patients with MS. That's another one, although I don't have a lot of MS patients. Pretty much other kinds of autoimmune disease, including Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and sometimes cancer patients. I've seen that it seems to be the best with lymphoma patients and less effective, although variable, with other kinds of cancer.
And what kind of results are you seeing?
Like everything, I would say there's a certain percentage that is, I would say, dramatic in the sense of you take somebody with, 10 bloody stools and 20, 30 pounds of weight loss, and within a couple months they're basically asymptomatic. And I wouldn't say that's the usual situation, but it certainly happens in maybe a quarter of the people. And another 50%, that combined with what I would call my opiate-free diet, that produces significant relief. And then there's probably 20% or so that seem to not get much benefit. So I would say that's kind of the breakdown.
Okay. And you were telling me about a book you have written.
Yeah, we just, there's two, but the last one is basically Nourishing Traditions for Baby and Child Care, and I do describe using low-dose naltrexone even for children, and that partly came out of a case that I had with actually a child of 18 months who was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is not a very fun disease for a child. And the combination of what's called the GAPS diet and low-dose naltrexone and fermented turmeric, which I use a fair amount of, as an anti-inflammatory. And the child has been in remission now for over a year and no sign of the disease. So that was
amazing.
a very important and powerful Naltrexone case.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask how you work out the dose for a child that young?
I start with about 1 milligram, and I know that some people have talked about using it, as an ointment, but I've never really done that. I don't really trust that. I'm sure it's possible, but I haven't done that. So I give them first 1 milligram, and then I will go up to a maximum of even 4.5, although usually I would stop with 2.25 milligrams.
Mm-hmm. And do you give it in liquid form?
No, I have tablets that I have made up to be basically excipient free, because I don't like some of the excipients that they put in a lot of capsules.
Mm-hmm.
And we can split it and crush it and dissolve it in water or whatever.
Okay. What other conditions have you treated children with?
Ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and occasionally asthma.
Mm-hmm. It's very sad, isn't it, that children so young get such awful conditions?
Yeah, I mean, first 10 years of my practice, I never saw anything like that. Next 10 years, a little bit more, and now it's pretty common.
What would you put that down to? Is it the changes in the way we're living, things we're eating?
Yeah, I think, I mean, without trying to be melodramatic, I think we're basically a civilization, if you want to call it that, or a culture in decline.
Mm-hmm.
And basically any culture that doesn't understand that their land and soil and water and air is their most precious resource is basically doomed to fail. And that would describe Western civilization pretty much to a T.
Mm-hmm.
So we're basically in environmental decline, and therefore the people are deteriorating as well.
So as a summary, in your view, how would you sum up LDN?
I mean, how would I sum up LDN? If you go back and if I could do just a little bit of science here, there are, of course, a lot of different ways of people getting sick, but the predominant way that we get sick is because we have basically two immune systems. One is called the cell-mediated, otherwise known as Th1, and the second one is called the humoral, and otherwise known as Th2. The cell-mediated gets rid of intracellular, that means inside the cell, pathogens. Pathogens means infecting organisms.
Mm-hmm.
And the Th2 or humoral makes antibodies and gets rid of organisms, usually larger organisms like worms, before they infect the cell. The cell-mediated is based on white blood cells digesting cells that are infected and then essentially, quote, spitting them out through mucus and rash and fever and et cetera. And then the humoral system makes antibodies and remembers what happens so that we don't get the same infection over again.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if you take any naturally occurring illness, for instance, chickenpox, with chickenpox, the virus infects the cell. If you've never encountered that particular virus before, that provokes a cell-mediated reaction, which means you're sick for about a week to 10 days, fever, rash, mucus, cough, etc. And at that point, you've cleared the virus, you get better, and then you make antibodies to remember what happened, so if you ever encounter a chickenpox virus again, it doesn't infect your cells.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing to know about that situation is that what we call being sick is a cell-mediated response. It's not the virus that makes us sick. The virus triggers a cell-mediated response, but you can make somebody sick by just giving them the chemicals that stimulate a cell-mediated response. And on the other hand, if you suppress the cell-mediated response with, say, cortisone or opiates, then you can get infected with a virus that could even kill you, but you'll never get what we call sick. So it's important to know that what we call being sick is a cell-mediated response. And then we remember what happened so we don't get it again. And that, as I said, that happens with every naturally occurring infection. Modern medicine has been basically an assault on the cell-mediated response. So every time we get, quote, sick, we give antibiotics, antipyretics like fever, like Tylenol, aspirin, etc., to suppress the cell-mediated response. We also give vaccines, which for the first time in human history stimulate a humoral response without a cell-mediated response. The reason is because if you gave somebody a measles vaccine and they got sick, the parents would complain that you just made my child sick. So the whole point of a vaccine is to stimulate an antibody response without a humoral response.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that suppresses the cell-mediated response is opiates. And this is known with cancer medicine in particular. Cancer, autoimmune diseases are in particular a failure of the cell-mediated response. The definition of an autoimmune disease is too many antibodies. That's how we diagnose, say, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. We look for antibodies. That's how we diagnose rheumatoid arthritis. We look for antibodies. In general, all those autoimmune diseases, the definition is a situation of increased antibodies, that is, increased humoral immunity as compared to cell-mediated immunity. And that's also the situation with cancer. There is no humoral immunity to cancer. The immunity to cancer is a cell-mediated white blood cell phenomena. And so if you have a medical system that has an assault on the cell-mediated response and pushes what's called this Th1 to Th2 shift, so that millions of people are walking around with too many antibodies and a suppressed cell-mediated response, you get a lot of autoimmune disease and cancer. That shift can also happen through chronic opiate abuse. Now, so you asked about how does naltrexone work. Now, part of the cell-mediated response mechanism is stimulated through the endorphin response. Endorphins are endogenous opiates. So when you give people exogenous opiates like morphine, you suppress the cell-mediated response. They get more immune disease, more cancer. On the other hand, if you stimulate endorphins, you stimulate a healthy cell-mediated response, and you counteract that tendency towards cancer and autoimmune disease. And simply put, that's how naltrexone works, or low-dose naltrexone.
Mm-hmm.
By stimulating an endorphin response, you're essentially engaging in the rehabilitation of the cell-mediated immune system, which is basically chronically, like we have lots of wars, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, war on drugs, war on whatever. We have a war on the cell-mediated immune system. The problem is, unlike most of the wars, we're winning this war. And that has huge consequences for our health, And that's why low-dose naltrexone is such a universal medicine, because this mechanism is at work with asthma, allergies, eczema, autoimmune disease, and cancer, and that's probably 60% of the diseases, chronic diseases that people suffer from.
Well, before we go, Thomas, would you like to give people your website address so they could find out more about you?
Yeah, it's fourfoldhealing.com, which is fourfoldhealing.com.
And thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Okay.